In the preceding chapters, starting with Athaliah, we've had a series of monarchs rise and fall to conspiracy and assassination. Uzziah will be the first king to bring any stability to the land. His reign, though, ends up being a sort of fusion between David and Saul. Uzziah becomes exceedingly strong, language that puns with his eventual maal, his trespass. And we'll begin with verse 1, which takes us mentally back to the last video we did. And it reads, "And all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king instead of his father, Amaziah." It says here he was 16 years old when he began to reign in place of, or instead of, his father. Last video we looked at Till's reconstruction, and it makes a lot of sense to see this verse not as taking place at the end of Amaziah's 29 years, but as a flashback to Amaziah's military loss to Joash of Israel. So in roughly Amaziah's 5th year, he's defeated and taken hostage, and then the people put the 16-year-old Uzziah on the throne in place of his absent father. And that reconstruction might also explain the wording in verse 2, which reads, "He built Eloth and restored it to Judah, after the king slept with his fathers." This seems to be another way of crediting Uzziah with accomplishing this feat at some point during his solo reign, not during his lengthy co-reign with his father. But we move into some of the biographical details, his mother's name. Then we get into verse 4. "He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. And as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper." And so that's very much in line with what we've seen so far from the chronicler. As long as the kings are seeking the Lord, they are going to prosper. And Johnstone notes here that we have a positive note here about Uzziah, but given that the standard of comparison is his father, Amaziah, who ended in failure, we should not take this at extreme face value. There is going to be a critique. It's just the chronicler often holds off that critique until later it becomes more relevant for his narrative. Now, what's interesting is this Zechariah figure here, and I think this is me. I think I wrote this. "Nothing is known about this Zechariah, though he shares the name of the martyred son of Jehoiada." There are a number of verbal links between 2 Chronicles 26:5, this verse here, and the speech of the martyred prophet in 2 Chronicles 24:20 through 22. And these are like the dying words of Zechariah. Whoever he is, he seems to have a similar influence Jehoiada had on Joash. So as long as Jehoiada, the priest, was alive, he was instructing Joash. As soon as he dies, Joash kind of goes off the rails. But little is known about this prophet side from that. In fact, even what kind of prophet he is a bit of a question because of this language here, fear of God. So this is based on an emendation. And so Johnstone, in his commentary, writes, "What he instructed him in is also uncertain. The text appears to read, 'in the seeing of God,' because that's more literally what this would read, which the JPSV takes to mean visions, in which case Zechariah would be a prophetic figure. Others, like the NRSV as well as the ESV here, adjust the text slightly to read, 'in fearing God,' in which case he might be a priestly teacher. Obedience to Zechariah's teaching also attaches a condition to Uzziah's reign. Only for so long and in so far as he sought the Lord," again, our key language here, "did God cause him to prosper." Another thematic term in 1 Chronicles. But whoever he is helping the king Uzziah to seek the Lord and thus prosper. And we get down to verse 6, "And he went out and made war against the Philistines and broke through the wall of Gath and the wall of Jabneh and the wall of Ashdod, and he built cities in the territory of Ashdod and elsewhere among the Philistines." So now, not only has he pushed back the Philistines, he's actually gained territory and built within their territory. But what's especially interesting here is this broke through language. It's significant for two reasons. One is this cross-references back into last chapter. Amaziah falls into apostasy, and so Joash comes to Jerusalem and he breaks down the walls of Jerusalem. But now his son, Uzziah, is seeking the Lord, and now he is breaking down the walls of his enemies. And a lot of this brings to mind First Chronicles, where we ran into this term a number of times. It began with David. But here in First Chronicles 13, this is where this language begins in this narrative sequence. It begins in verse 2, where David burst out. It's translated here as send abroad, but it's break forth, break out. So he breaks out with a plan to move the ark. And it's an ill-advised plan because it doesn't involve the priests. And typologically, this is a bit like the taking of the forbidden fruit kind of idea. It's a lack of respect in the holiness domain. And so when Uzziah reaches out to catch hold of the ark, the Lord breaks out against him. It's the same language. And so they call that place Perez Uzziah. And they end up leaving the ark with Obed-Edom. But then we get into the next chapter against the Philistines. Here we are again with the Philistines. And specifically, they camp out in the valley of Rephaim, which the Greek actually translates that, the valley of the giants. And so David asks, will you deliver them into my hand? God says, yes, go forward. And they go and they win there. And so they call that place Baal Perazim, the Lord of the breakthrough, or the Lord of breaking through, because he breaks through against his enemies. Again, this bursting flood language, also breakthrough language. And so when David consults with the Lord, he is able to then break through. When he seeks the Lord, he can break through. When he doesn't, the Lord breaks out against his own people, like we just saw earlier with Amaziah. When he falls into apostasy, the enemies of Judah broke through against them. But now Uzziah is seeking the Lord and is breaking through the enemy's walls, specifically the Philistines. And I don't think it's coincidental that here in verse 7, God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians, so on and so forth. This help language pops up a lot in chapter 12 specifically, as you can see all the blue highlights. And this is a divine help, especially in 1 Chronicles 12. It's a bit cryptic, but if you were to count out these names, I've highlighted them in blue, there are 26 individuals that help David. And 26 is the value of the divine name Yahweh. Yahweh sends David a Yahweh number of warriors to come and help him. And so similarly, Uzziah is being helped against his enemies. And his fame, literally his name, spreads all the way to the border of Egypt. For he became very strong. This very strong language, again, as we've noted, is a pun on maal, trespass. Of course, here it's positive. His exceedingly great, his exceedingly strong. So seek the Lord and become exceedingly strong. But if you don't seek the Lord, you commit a maal. You fall into that, this trespass, which we're going to see here with Uzziah. Of course, the strong language also is a key term. And so because the Lord is helping Uzziah with his enemies, he's able to defeat them, and as a result, others, because of his name and his fame is spreading, others come and pay him tribute. And then in verses 9 and 10, he gets to some building projects, including for the first time, as far as I can recall, agricultural projects. And we get this language here in verse 10, for he loved the soil. And soil here is adamah. And Lightheart writes, he builds towers in Jerusalem and in the wilderness, apparently to guard the frontiers of Judah. He builds up. He also digs cisterns, building down to get to water. Uzziah's kingdom reaches to heaven, includes the land, and reaches down to the waters below. He needs the water because he is a keeper of livestock, like one of the patriarchs. He is a shepherd king, a new Adam, who rules over animals as well as the land. He pays for men to work the fields and the vineyards, growing grain and grapes and olive trees, sacramental plants that, along with the livestock, supply the worship of the temple. He pursues these projects because he is a lover of the adamah, a unique phrase in the Bible. And then we get to verses 11 and following, and Uzziah musters his troops. Though we don't have the tax of Moses mentioned, we do see Uzziah number the army under the supervision of others. For instance, this officer here, as well as this secretary, or elsewhere this language is used of scribes. But this would seem to be the best equipped army we've seen so far in Chronicles. Coats of mail, bows, and stones for slinging, helmets shields, spears, as well as siege or anti-siege equipment. In verse 15 here, it has, he made machines invented by skillful men. It's actually a pretty redundant line, literally in Hebrew. It would be designed things designed by designers. It's this language right here. And so they build these towers that can shoot arrows and stones at the enemy. And again, his name or his fame spreads far, for he was marvelously helped till he was strong. Some interesting words used here. Strong is, of course, this language we've seen through Chronicles. As long as the kings are faithful, they are established, made strong. But sometimes this strength leads to pride, as we're about to see. And again, helped here is this ezer language we've seen earlier in this section. In light of this divine help that makes the kings strong, this marvelous language is especially interesting because it brings to mind Judges 13 and the parents of Samson and the birth of Samson. So as I click on this, we should get a highlight over here. And so moving down to verse 15 or so, they ask to prepare a young goat for the angel of the Lord. They don't know he's the angel of the Lord yet. But he says, if you detain me, I will not eat your food, but prepare it for the Lord. And then they ask him his name. This is very similar to Jacob wrestling with the angel, and he asks his name. And like that story, the angel here doesn't give the name, as he says, why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful? And again, this language shows up again to the one who works wonders, of course, referring to God. And of course, the narrative concludes with them preparing this animal, watching the sacrifice, and then the angel goes up into the flame and ascends to heaven. And of course, all of this also brings to mind another interesting passage in Isaiah 9, probably the one you're thinking of, 9:6. For to us a child is born, so on and so forth. His name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And I think this Isaiah reference will become even more interesting as we move down further. But for our purposes here, this is divine help that's making him strong. It's marvelous help. This kind of marvelous language is also tied to the works of wonders that God does, like in the Exodus and things like that. But as great as this beginning is, Uzziah is in for a fall. So immediately after being made strong with this divine help from the Lord, because of this strength, in verse 16, he grew proud to his destruction, for he was unfaithful to the Lord his God, and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. And this destruction language, if you've been following along with 2 Chronicles, you probably already recognize this language because this is Exodus language. This is 1 Chronicles 21 language. This is anti-Passover language. And it also brings to mind earlier in Amaziah's reign, when the prophet tells Amaziah that his idolatry is forbidden, he's wrong for this. Amaziah tells the prophet to be quiet, but he gives one last word to him. He says, I know that God has determined to destroy you. Again, anti-Passover language. So as Uzziah grows powerful, he grows proud, leads to his destruction. And we'll take a look at Lightheart. He says, Uzziah becomes strong and prospers, but just at that climax, things fall apart. The chronicler repeats the verb become strong at the end of verse 15 at the beginning of verse 16. He was strong. When he became strong, his heart was lifted up. His strength lifts his heart high. That might be a good thing. And see 2 Chronicles 17:6. I think that's a unique positive reference to this language. But in this case, it is not. Uzziah's strength leads him to act corruptly in a way that brings destruction. So it's, again, he's talking about this language here. The chronicler uses a pun to reinforce the catastrophe. At his height, when the Ammonites brought tribute, Uzziah was exalted. And again, that's that exceedingly great language. Now he falls because he commits a maal, which is this unfaithful language. And Johnstone similarly comments here that with all this strength, he's established what is he going to do with this strength. The outcome is arrogant self-reliance, which brings down destruction on himself. Chronicles uses the verb related to the term the destroyer of the negative Passover, which he has employed in similar fashion in 1 Chronicles 21:12. Of course, this is when David seeks to number the people without following the proper channels and is perhaps seeking to establish himself via human strength, human military strength, rather than relying on the Lord and his promises. But continuing with Johnstone, in his account, the hinge event of David's reign. To convey the enormity of the offense, Chronicles introduces one of the principal key terms of his whole work, maal, violation of the rights of God. And so while up to this point, Uzziah had been described of in Davidic terms, positively, receiving help and things like that, we're now seeing vocabulary pick up on the unique failures of David, as well as the archetypal failure of a king in Saul, the maal language. And specifically concerning this incense, the burning of incense, Johnstone writes, Uzziah's successes have gone to his head and caused him to misread the situation. There must have been a strong desire on the part of the monarchy to reassert the right of the king to act as high priest for his people. Perhaps this is one of the attractions of the old Canaanite religion, that the king could officiate directly in the cult. So Amaziah in 2 Chronicles 25:14, or Ahaz in 2 Chronicles 28:3. And so while there's a sympathetic way of reading Uzziah, in that he was just trying to do the right thing, he got a little bit carried away. This was somewhat an act of syncretism and a violation of the boundaries that God had set. Because originally you did have David and even Solomon, to some level, do priestly activities. But their sins separated these offices from each other. And rather than respect that boundary that God had set up, Uzziah crosses that boundary. In fact, many of the early church fathers and early church figures point to Uzziah's attempting to take over the other side. They said a lot about this. This was kind of like Adam's sin of seizing the forbidden fruit. And so you'll see this typological type reading a lot from the early church figures and fathers. So, for example, Ephraim the Syrian, as well as John Chrysostom. So Ephraim considered Uzziah's sin to be akin to that committed by Adam. Both men attempted to chart their own advancement to wisdom, in the case of Adam, and to the priesthood, in the case of Uzziah, rather than obey God. In Ephraim's poetic Hymns on Paradise, Uzziah's entrance into the temple is equivalent to Adam's approach to the tree of knowledge. Adam seized the fruit of the tree, Uzziah the censer of incense. Uzziah's leprosy had the same effect as Adam's discovery of his nakedness. Both men hid their bodies, having become a cause for shame. In their attempts to gain the treasure they desired, they lost the good things they already possessed. And perhaps this is necessary because of the hardness of people's hearts, that the offices should remain separated to serve as something of like a firewall. Otherwise, you have one figure in authority, and that can easily slide into tyranny. But we'll continue with the narrative. So he enters in to the house, to the temple, to burn incense. Verse 17, but Azariah the priest went in after him, with 80 priests of the Lord who were men of valor. And they withstood King Uzziah and said to him, it is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for you have done wrong, and it will bring you no honor from the Lord God. And done wrong is maal. Verse 19, then Uzziah was angry. Now he had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And when he became angry with the priest, leprosy broke out on his forehead in the presence of the priest in the house of the Lord, by the altar of incense. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead. And they rushed him out quickly, and he himself hurried to go out, because the Lord had struck him. And King Uzziah was a leper to the day of his death, and being a leper lived in a separate house, for he was excluded from the house of the Lord. and Jotham his son was over the king's household, governing the people of the land. And then verses 22 and following, it gets into the biographical details, although I do want to note in verse 22, now the rest of the acts of Uzziah from first to last, Isaiah, the prophet of the son Amos, wrote. And this is Isaiah, the Isaiah. So I want to loop back to that point. First, we will begin noting this language here. And so Johnstone writes, there must be a cross-reference here to Exodus 28, 36 through 38. And let's just go ahead and bring this out. In Exodus reads, you shall make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it like the engraving of a signet, holy to the Lord. And so this is referring to the plate that is on the high priest's head. And so the fact that the leprosy breaks out on his forehead is somewhat ironic. So he becomes something of like an anti-priest. And in fact, when I was studying this, I'd forgotten about this note. I don't know when I wrote this note, but I thought it was kind of interesting. But I wrote this. It's possible these 7 letters, and I'm referring to the holy to the Lord in Hebrew, perhaps they're referenced in Zechariah 3, 8 through 9. And actually, let me just go ahead and bring this out. Hear now, O Joshua, the high priest. And of course, if you know this, Joshua is basically the name Jesus. Joshua, the high priest, you and your friends who sit before you, for they are men who are a sign. Behold, I will bring my servant, the branch. Very messianic language there, both servant and branch. For behold, on the stone that I have set before Joshua, again, Jesus, on a single stone with 7 eyes, I will engrave on its inscription, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. So the 7 eyes, quote unquote, and the 7 letters, and then of course you have this engraving language. But I just thought that was interesting that you have this Joshua figure mixed here with high priest as well as this messianic servant branch language. Very interesting, but let's get back to Johnstone. Concerning the leprosy on the forehead, he says, again, it's probably a reference back to this plate, this gold plate on the priest's forehead. It's to hang on the cord of the high priest's turban on Aaron's forehead. It is to be worn so that Aaron may bear the guilt attaching to any shortfall in the offerings of holy things which the Israelites make. It shall lie on his forehead forever as a means of securing acceptance for them from the Lord. So far from the priestly pendant announcing that the requirements of the laws of holiness have been strictly observed, and with a genuine intention, leprosy has broken out on Uzziah's brow as a statement of the total unacceptability of the king's burning of incense. Not only is it unacceptable, it is a pollution of the temple. And he points out the lengthy purification rites of leprosy. So far from Uzziah being able to officiate on behalf of his people in the temple, he is an outcast. Were he ever to be pronounced cleansed of his condition, he would need the services of the priesthood, not less for the guilt offering. And so he needs the very priesthood that he attempted to usurp to ever declare him clean. And concerning this language that the Lord had struck him, Lightheart in his commentary writes, Uzziah experiences his own reverse exodus and reverse conquest. Leprosy is like an Egyptian plague, and Uzziah's life is marked by this plague for the rest of his life. He is cast out, not from the land, but from the temple. Stricken with leprosy, he cannot even assemble in the temple courts for worship or return to his own palace. With Uzziah living in a separate house, his son Jotham takes over royal responsibilities. Even in death, Uzziah is excluded. He is buried with his fathers, not in the city of David, but in the field of the tomb, since he was a leper. Uzziah's sin throws his life into reverse. He begins like a David, fighting and building and organizing and growing and harvesting. Because he acts with an exalted heart, a prideful heart, he dies like Saul, a king who committed a sacrilege, maal, and was excluded from royal privileges. Uzziah is an Adam, seizing forbidden privilege. His life limps to the end in a series of Adamic exclusions. Now, in light of this story of a king who is trying to act in this role of priest, especially doing so out of pride. It's very interesting in light of Isaiah 6. So the call of Isaiah. Normally we speed read the introductions of the call of the prophets because it's kind of boring. What king, what year, his parents' name, stuff like that. But in Isaiah's calling, it reads, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon the throne." So this is when he gets that vision. The Isaiah 6 vision that's very well known, very divine council stuff. You have the seraphim flying around. Holy is the Lord of hosts, all of that stuff. But it happens in the year this king dies. Not the year he was struck with leprosy, by the way, but the year he finally dies. But what's so interesting is look at the vision itself. So the Lord is sitting upon a throne in verse 1, and the train of his robe filled the temple. If you were to chase down those references, the vocabulary used there, it brings to mind Exodus language, specifically with the priest's robes. These are priestly robes. So he's sitting on the throne wearing priestly attire. And you move down, verse 4, it should be noted that the house was filled with smoke, presumably incense. That's how you would get the smoke. Verse 5, the well-known, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." So in the year that the king dies, a king who attempted to usurp the priestly functions and burn incense, the year that king dies, Isaiah has this vision where he sees the Lord on the throne, and he directly identifies him as the king, the Lord of hosts. So he's a king, but he's also wearing the priestly attire. You get the coal, the smoke, because the angel, the seraphim, is about to bring a burning coal from the altar. So you have a lot of these images. And so if you were doing a study on Isaiah and you get to Isaiah 6 or whatever, this story is an important backdrop to this vision, because finally Christ is going to merge those kingly and priestly offices together. And we've talked about that a lot so far in this series in Chronicles. But Robert Cole had a great article connecting these passages as well as looking at the broader context of Isaiah 6. And it's also worth mentioning those first couple chapters in Isaiah. There's a heavy emphasis on pride, how prideful the people are. And of course, this is what causes Uzziah to do what he does. It's arrogance, it's pride. But moving on, and we'll close out with this quote from Lightheart. And he writes that many assume that success depends on seizing whatever is in front of us, breaking boundaries, forcing ourselves forward. We think that pride is progressive. But the chronicler shows us otherwise. Pride may get us short-term gains, but in the long term, it is not progressive. Pride is regressive. Pride turns the clock back to where we started. We will be humbled, one way or another. Some of Judah's kings humble themselves and find mercy. Others are proud. But even proud kings are humbled. Everyone will bow the knee to the Lord Jesus. Better to do it voluntarily. And I thought that was a fitting conclusion to a king who began very well, but his pride led to his downfall. And since chapter 27 is so short, it's only 9 verses, I believe, we'll go ahead and throw this one in as well. And it should be noted that verse 23 of the last chapter does seem to imply here at the end that Jotham is co-reigning with Uzziah. So once Uzziah becomes a leper, his son begins to reign in his place, even while they're both alive still. And I think it's for this reason that Jotham largely gets excluded. He has such a short chapter because, according to Johnston, which I disagree with, one of the rare times, he actually says that Jotham was never a solo king. He was always co-reigning with somebody else. But Till suggests a 3-year solo reign for Jotham, but that's pretty short. I mean, he was mostly just co-reigning with others. In this case, with Uzziah, because he was a leper. And so he was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. What's funny is, more or less, this exact same phrase, or part of this verse, gets repeated verbatim in verse 8 here. And so Lightheart writes, 7 verses later, in case we have forgotten, the same is repeated. He was 25 years old, so on and so forth. If nothing else, this sets up a neatly symmetrical structure for the account of his reign. So it's very chiastic. You have the introduction, conclusion. He did right in the eyes of Yahweh like Uzziah. He became mighty because he ordered his ways to Yahweh. And then in the center, building projects, and then war and tribute. But overall, very short chapter. And here in verse 1, he gives his mother's name, the daughter of Zadok. And many believe, because this is commonly a priest name, that, again, we have evidence of intermarriage between the royal house and the priestly class as well. And in verse 2 is interesting because it says that he did right in the eyes of the Lord according to all that his father Uzziah had done, except he did not enter the temple of the Lord. And like I said, this is one of the rare times I agree with Klein, especially over Johnstone. He says the exception in Chronicles, usually the exception here is he'll say something and it says, except they did this, that, or the other thing. And usually that except is something bad. And he's saying the exception is not an evil that Jotham did, but a mistake of his father, which he avoided. So he did not enter the temple of the Lord. The vocabulary chosen is the same used for Uzziah's inappropriate encroachment on the temple in 2 Chronicles 26:16. Johnstone draws the unlikely conclusion that this clause is a limitation on the king's rightness. So in other words, this is a critique, claiming that the king did not present himself in the temple at his coronation. And so Johnstone sees this phrase as a negative. And part of why he thinks this is the case, that he didn't present himself in the temple, was because he doesn't believe he ever was a solo king, so he never actually went through that coronation process. But with Till's reconstruction, he would have actually reigned as a solo king for at least some time, so that's unlikely. And I think the fact that the same phrase is used for when Uzziah encroached into the temple space, that's what it's referring to. And so I would agree that it's saying he didn't do the same thing his father did. But continuing with verse 2, but the people still followed corrupt practices. And corrupt here, once again, is Passover language, anti-Passover language. And Lightheart writes, corruption, shakat, is a danger. It is the verb used to describe the evils of the generation prior to the flood. As long as the people of Judah continue in corruption, storm clouds are on the horizon, and a flood of Babylonians will soon be surging into Judah. As long as they are corrupt, Judah is stuck in the repetitive cycles of judges. And Klein points out that this is the same language that led to the destruction of Uzziah. It's his pride that leads him to this shakat type language. And then verses 3 and 4, it gets into Jotham's building projects. Again, good kings build. And verse 4 is interesting because it's actually very symmetrical. I like to note these whenever we get them, where the verse itself is completely chiastic, although you kind of need to see it more literally or read it more literally to kind of understand it. So more literally, it would read something like, in cities he built in the hill of Judah, and in the forest he built fortresses and towers. So if we look at it here, if you look at this little orange numbers down here, these numbers are the word order. So, moreover, cities he built in the hill country, so on and so forth. And then also, as we move further down in the verse after towers, notice here, this 11, this is also built, and it's missing. There's no translation for it. So this term goes untranslated. And again, it's built, which is B prime right here. And so again, word order, you would be after Judah, and on the wooded hills, he built forts and towers, etc., etc. So sometimes the English translation destroys that perfect chiasm, but if you look at it like this in Hebrew, you'll see it. And then in verse 5, he fought with the king of the Ammonites, prevailed against them, and so they give him tribute. And as Lightheart points out, this is the first time we've seen some of this stuff, wheat and barley, since Solomon. He writes, neither wheat nor barley have been mentioned in Chronicles since the reign of Solomon, in chapter 2. Jotham does not bring in wheat and barley on the scale of Solomon, and it receives tribute of silver rather than gold. So just more evidence that the kingdom is slowly falling apart, although Jotham has slowed the decay a bit. And what's also interesting here, just worth noting, This chapter is just so odd in so many ways. This particular phrase right here at the very end of verse 5 is actually sectioned off in the Masoretic text. So it kind of randomly cuts off verse 5. So I write, oddly, the MT has a small paragraph break separating this sentence. And Johnstone writes, by this almost whimsical division, the MT indicates very strongly where the main emphasis lies. The repeated payment is important, not so much in itself as in its significance for Jotham's standing. And I was actually wondering if there was some weird numerical thing going on with this chapter since it's so weird and short, but I didn't find any. I was very surprised by that. The only thing, not that this is even affected by it being so short, but verse 6 is 17 words long and verse 7 is 34 words long. Again, divine numbers, and of course 34 is 2 times 17. And then we get to the repeated line that he was 25 years old and he reigned 16 years. Although again, as we're going to see, especially with Ahaz following and looking at Till's reconstruction of the chronology, Jotham was co-reigning earlier with his father when he had leprosy until he passed away. And then Ahaz is going to basically take up the throne, but still allow Jotham to live. And so perhaps that's why his reign is so odd and so short, is he's around, but he's never really established completely as his own guy. And so we'll finish off with Lightheart as a bit of a conclusion as well as a preview. He writes in page 200 of his commentary, the Davidic Uzziah is followed by the Solomonic Jotham, a building king acknowledged by Gentiles. That is a hopeful sign, but the rhythms of Chronicles suggest that the trend will not continue into the next generation. After David and Solomon came Rehoboam and Jeroboam, divisions in the kingdom, and the spread of idolatry. It is poised to happen again. David, Solomon, Jeroboam, Rehoboam is replicated in Uzziah, Jotham, and then Ahaz. And so that's what we have to look forward to in chapters 28 and following, and I will see you guys then.